Compensation is probably like in the top 10, if not like the top five, some of the most challenging things that ministries deal with.
Welcome to the Kingdom One podcast, where we grow the church together. This podcast is here to give you big ideas and help you get practical with the tactical. Here's your host.
Kingdom One fam, welcome back to another podcast. My name is Nick, I'm your host. And if you're new to the Kingdom One family, I just want to say I'm so glad that you're here. If you've been paying attention to the news, you would have seen that Warner Brothers CEO was heckled during a commencement speech at Boston University. Students were chanting, "Pay your writers," and booing him. While the reality is nobody's going to be showing up to a Sunday morning service at your church and heckling your pastor to pay you more, we understand that compensation matters in ministry and in marketplace because it's tied to people's livelihoods. And so in today's podcast, we're going to ask the question, is compensation your ministry's Achilles heel? We'll hear from our HR team, and we're going to talk about top ways to attract talent through compensation and benefits. And we're also going to talk about how not to redline your budget by using actionable data like a compensation survey.
So sometimes in ministries, staff are underpaid, and there's this misconception that if you're working in ministry, for the Lord in that environment, then you should accept a wage that's lower than, one might potentially be able to live on. So while ministries are most likely nonprofit organization and almost always will pay less than for-profit organizations, employees should still be compensated fairly and in alignment with the organization's financial position, right? Because there's a balance there, like what's fair to pay employees, but also what can the organization afford.
Did I hear you just say amen? I agree with Whitney, and I think that where she started the conversation and where she's taking it is crucial. We have to demystify compensation in ministry spaces.
Granted, I love ministry. I've been in it for a long time. I love the fact that I get to work for the Lord, but there is also a reality that I think ministries need to understand. I'll just talk about Southern California. Like, there's some realities of living in Southern California, and a lot of that is compensation. Like, you have to have a healthy or a reasonable compensation in this area in order to rent a home, to put food on the table, all of the things. So I think for ministries, just being mindful of that would be helpful.
You're hearing from our CHRO, Trina Myers. She has a lot of experience and has seen firsthand what undercompensation can do to staff as individuals and your total staff culture.
It could lead to a number of other things, including exhaustion and burnout, because employees sometimes, when they're underpaid significantly, need to make up that compensation to be able to live. So they're working a second or third job, and often their families feel that. So as a ministry, I think this is an area where the ministry can come alongside the family and pay them fairly. They'll never be paid what a for-profit organization would pay their employees. But there are benchmarks out there where you can look at what other churches are paying or what other nonprofits in the area are paying and make a substantial difference in that employee's life so that they are engaged. They don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs, that they can actually be there and be present for their family.
At the end of the day, we're called to be stewards of all that God has entrusted to us, and that includes our ministry compensation.
This is Kendra Holyby, our COO, and her unique position on compensation is really different. It looks at compensation from a leader and pastoral level.
And in ministry, I will say that compensation honestly is like the Wild Wild West, we like to call it. Because there's all sorts of wild things that people do to try to take care of their people. And sometimes they're not always legal. Sometimes they're not always the best way to steward the resources of the organization. And so creating a compensation plan with lots of guardrails and resources to make sure that ministries can land in a really wise place with compensation decisions. And so it's really important that we are, at the end of the day, a really great steward of all that God has entrusted to us.
There's definitely a tension to manage here because we want to be good stewards of what we have, but there is a time and a place where we are not walking in faith and we could be frugal because of fear. Kendra further explains how this frugality out of fear could lead to disobedience to God.
He talked about organizational pay and actually mentions it in 1 Timothy 5:18, the verse where it says, "Do not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. The worker deserves his wages." And his commentary, Warren Wiersbe, says, it's God's plan that the needs of the servants be met by the local churches, and he will bless churches that are faithful to his servants. So if a church is not faithful and its staff needs are not met, it's actually a poor testimony. And that's an important factor, is that when you underpay, it's not just like, man, I'm getting the best bang for my buck. That's not how it works with staff pay. You really want to make sure that you're providing a fair wage for the work that they are doing. And so there's a greater, I think, consequence to not just keeping up, is that it creates a lot of angst for the employee, but also like, what are we telling the world about our witness when people go out into the world and they say, yeah, like I'm just paid really crappy because I work in ministry. And that's the excuse that we make a lot. But I do believe that the work that our employees are doing are so important that we should find what the fair wage is and then work towards getting our budget set up in a way that can afford to pay them what they're worth, and not over and not under at the same time.
If you're not doing organizational leveling, if you don't have a really clear compensation strategy, including a compensation philosophy, range penetration, like all these different things that you have thought about, then to be frank, you are probably finding yourself struggling right now a little bit in this deep tension of feeling maybe a bit burdened with, man, it has just become so expensive to do ministry in states like California. When in reality, that's not necessarily true, but I think this is all the more of a case to be made for let's really get a lot sharper when it comes to how we tackle compensation in the ministry world.
That is Stephen Bush, our Chief Vision Officer. It was so good. I want you to hear some more.
I know this might feel like a weird, sort of segue into, what does it look like when you have sort of poor compensation structures for your staff. But I think, frankly, the highest level of a response line is it's poor stewardship, right? And so either you find yourself, in essence, not truly having the appropriate compensation for the work being done, right? And so we want to have a good pairing to say, man, here's the scope, here's the complexity, here's the level of autonomy, discretion, and those types of things that this role requires of you. And if I'm overpaying you for that, that is not good stewardship. I see that a lot in ministries where you might have somebody who has a lot of tenure there, and so by sort of the virtue of tenure, they're getting paid a fair amount. But substantively, what they're being asked to do, whether it's because there's been a number of organizational design shifts or whatever, a lot of times we'll see people, it's like, man, like they're doing this very narrow job for this great amount of compensation. That's not fair to them. That's not fair to you. In fact, you're probably incentivizing them maybe in an unhealthy way to say it's okay to do very, very little to receive much. And so I think, again, we would say, man, that is not good use of tithe dollars, of dollars from our constituency, our donors, those types of things.
Compensation is a tension to be managed. If you underpay your staff, we've talked about the problems that could happen there, but now we're moving into the territory of overcompensating and what kind of problems that creates.
Depending on where it exists, right? And what I mean by that is like which job is being overpaid, right? And which positions, like looking at the broad scale of the organization, that can be harmful for a couple of reasons. One thing is this like idea of golden handcuffs, right? When an employee is overpaid for the role that they're in, that like no matter where else they look, they can never make that much money. People will stay for the wrong reasons, right? They stay solely based on money, which can, I've just seen toxicity flourish when that has happened. And it can be really hurtful to a culture, to an environment, when there's a person who wants to leave, maybe even, sees that they should go somewhere else because they're not fulfilled, they're not happy, they're not engaged in their work. But their priority right now might be compensation, and they stay. And, that can be hurtful for a team because there is an element of turnover that's healthy. Sometimes you can't see people grow into their God-given calling at one organization. Like, they need to leave. They need to have a, varying background to step into where God's taking them to. So sometimes that golden handcuffs, it could keep someone somewhere that could, definitely move into unhealth.
I have seen it happen, unfortunately, and it takes years to sort of undo, if you will, because once you sort of pay a pastor a certain level, I've yet to see a ministry pull money away from that person and say, "Hey, we're overpaying you, so we're going to take money back." And I wouldn't even honestly recommend that. Kind of what we do in the HR space is we kind of call it in marketplace. It's called like we redline somebody. And when we redline somebody in compensation, it basically means like your overall annual salary will not increase, and it may not increase for a long time because you're either over or at the top of the range for your position. And that doesn't mean that they can't get bonuses or merit things that might warrant on the spot type recognition. But it just means that we kind of have to like freeze them for a little bit to make sure that the rest of the organization can catch up. If you overcompensate and then the economy changes, then now you've just really, really overcompensated somebody. So it's really important to benchmark and make sure that you've got a good sense of what someone should be paid for a position like that based on what the budget and tithes of your organization kind of allow. And it does seep into the rest of the organization, especially I think they lose a sense of, even through their sermons, sometimes you catch things from them and they don't realize it. They don't realize that they've identified themselves as living in a different way that's probably different from the rest of the common people that probably attend their church. And without naming any names, I'm not pointing fingers at anybody. I've heard pastors in sermons saying that at one point they made their child shop at like Target or Walmart as a punishment for something that they had done because they wanted to teach them a lesson. And I don't think that senior leader really recognized in that moment that what they were doing was basically saying that Target or Walmart was a step down for them to send their kid to, which is all fine. But for most of us, that's where we shop normally. And so I think that's where there is a disconnect. And I don't think they always recognize it because they kind of have used to been living away for a very long time. And they get really disconnected from the realities of like, man, I'm sitting in the audience going like, that's where I always shop. So I don't really know, how's that a punishment? I love going to Target. Like, that's exciting to me. So, I mean, it has tentacles and it's not always like the downfall of an organization, but it certainly is a moment where you start to go like, man, is it helpful for that person's posture, spirit, and also in the leading of the people that generally speaking might attend my church to kind of be too far above where the average is of your congregation.
Yeah, and compensation isn't easy, right? It's truly an art. It's not a science at all. I don't know. Some people might fight me on that, but it's an art. So overpaying in relation to, the market or peer group, it can limit role growth, for that person and impact over time, right? If they're like topped out for the job that they're in, but they don't have a skill set that could take them to, a progressive next level, there might not be any opportunity for them to grow their skill set, right? Because maybe they want to shift to another department, but they're not going to get paid as much. So they're like, no, I'll stay here. And then they're sort of cornered.
You're like, cool, but like, how do I know if I'm overpaying, underpaying? You have to engage in things like compensation surveys and studies. You need to be benchmarking against sort of the marketplace environment. You need to be understanding and studying to know when a particular, even sort of job family or discipline within your ministry, perhaps like productions, for example, if the whole market is shifting when it comes to the compensation for that type of individual on your staff, you need to know that, understand that, and have a plan to say either we're going to be able to meet that shift or we're understanding we need to kind of catch up to that over the next couple budget cycles or fiscal years, so to speak. And so it takes study and it takes intentionality. This is not a passive activity of, really stewarding compensation well. It takes some real intentionality and initiative on our part to make sure that we're doing a good job in that space.
The first things I believe HR should do is work with their senior leadership to clarify and determine what the ministry's compensation philosophy is, right? How do they think about their staff and how do they want to pay them, including benefits, right? Including vacation time, all of those things. Without this critical piece in place, effective compensation management would be very difficult to achieve.
It's become increasingly evident that lack of compensation philosophy and the data from surveys can leave your ministry blind to overcompensation and keeping seasoned ministry leaders in golden handcuffs. To steward your staff and resources well, you can go to sparkstaffing.co/compensation to get started on a compensation survey that is actionable and backed with survey data. Spark Staffing Compensation is easy to use, it's fun, and it includes a 1-hour consultation call with a ministry expert that will distill and customize the insights to your ministry so that you have action items associated with your data. Zip on over to sparkstaffing.co/compensation to get started today. Let's round out today's conversation on ways that your ministry can stay compliant when it comes to compensation and also attracting and keeping top talent.
More recent one that just came out in California, it's called SB 1162. You might be more familiar with it if you're hearing this podcast. It's sort of that kind of reporting of your compensation law. And so basically what it means is that, a lot of times compensation is this sort of like shadow game where it's like, we'll tell you after you accept the job, then we'll maybe tell you what you're going to make, and we'll hope and pray that you don't say never mind. And so this law basically says, I have to tell you the range is for the role that you're applying for. I have to put it in the job posting itself.
Yeah, I mean, compensation is a really tactical thing at the end of the day for an employee. They need to know that what you're going to pay them is actually going to be able to pay their bills. And that's just a fact of life. And that's not just ministry, that's everywhere. Anytime someone goes to look for a job, they need to know that what the pay provided is going to either allow them to uphold their way of living, or if they're going to have to make changes, are they willing to sacrifice and make the changes for that kind of pay? So compensation is a tactical thing. And I actually think a lot of organizations would do themselves a lot of favors by just having more open and honest conversation about pay and not making it so faux pas to be like, oh, I'm asking for how much money I'm going to make. It's like, well, yeah, I need to know that before I can say yes to something.
So under the pay equity of 2016 revisions, it explicitly states that retaliation against employees who seek to enforce the law is illegal, and it makes it illegal for employers to prohibit employees from discussing or inquiring about their coworkers' wages.
We are talking about the California Equal Pay Act, and to condense this for you, there are two main factors of this act that are very important to bring visibility to. And the first is that you should have pay ranges on your job postings to bring visibility to what that pay is. That's what our ministry experts are talking about here. But there is a second thing, and that is equal pay for the equal job. And this is really important to qualify because this is one of the most frequently asked questions is, under the new law, how is the bona fide factor other than sex applied? Meaning that how can we justify, pay differentials? This act is here to help us pay men and women equally. But under the law, an employer may defeat an equal pay claim by proving that the wage differential is due to a bona fide factor other than sex. And some examples of this are education, training, or experience. There is a link to this government article below in the show notes, and that's there for you to do your due diligence in understanding this law. You may be experiencing this right now where your staff is talking about compensation, and if you're at a loss on what to do, Kendra has some great tactics in order for you to focus their attention to the mission and vision of your organization.
Yeah, I mean, you can never stop people from talking about their pay. And I will say in almost every organization for as long as I've been in HR, you can tell people like, hey, your pay is confidential. You probably shouldn't talk about it. It doesn't stop people. And it's for as long as I've been in HR, pay equity has been an issue. So as an organization, you can alleviate all those kinds of conversations by just having a clear process as to how you tackle compensation, and also bringing clarity and communication to your staff about how it's determined. And that's through creating like a compensation philosophy for your organization to say, this is when we give increases, this is why we give them, this is how we determine where we land in compensation. so that there's some guardrails that you can explain easily to anybody on your staff. And usually that thwarts any kinds of those conversations. If they do happen, there's nothing to really be ashamed of. And people kind of go like, oh, okay, that makes sense. You've been doing this 20 years and I've only done this 5. So that makes a sense why, you're getting paid more than me and that sort of thing.
Hey, you okay there? I know this is a lot to take in when it comes to compensation. If you ever feel lost or you have a question, we would love to answer it for you. Just email us at hello@kingdom1.co. As we wrap this podcast, let's hear about attracting top talent.
Well, perhaps you might say, our salaries, I'll kind of use some compensation lingo here. We're targeting like the 40th percentile of range penetration, meaning that, within a range, we're going to kind of be a little bit on the lower end, even a little bit below, perhaps the median of sort of that range. However, we have decided as a ministry, as part of our compensation philosophies, that we're going to go really rich on the benefits side. Like we're going to pay for 100% of your benefits, your family, obviously participating in medical, dental, vision, et cetera. And so that factors into kind of combining your salary plus your benefits. Think of now sort of a new expanded range in a sense, and maybe you're actually a little bit more competitive than you realize thinking through, that big number. And I've sat with people as I've offered jobs to individuals when I was in local church ministry, and they're like, that's $5,000 less than I'm making right now. And it's tell me about your benefits at, wherever you're coming from, marketplace or ministry. And, do you have sort of these different variables in terms of benefit offerings? And they're like, no, but they would get fixated on that salary number. And I was like, well, I can demonstrate to you how actually you're making, maybe $5,000 more in total comp coming here to work with our ministry. And we are so excited to offer you that compensation package. We're actually not shying away from the salary number because we're looking at the total compensation number and picture. And so I think all of these factors ultimately contribute to what that individual is receiving. Therefore, I think it's really important as we have this conversation about compensation, we don't just fixate on salary or fixate on sort of hourly rate. You really need to think about the whole picture, and the design of your compensation should have the whole picture in mind.
When you're looking at building the total reward strategy, it really involves just a deliberate integration of these 5 key elements that you can use to attract, motivate, and retain those staff members that really are the heart and soul of your organization, right? They're the ones that keep you on mission in your ministry. So at Kingdom One, our 5 elements are, compensation, which could be base pay and any type of variable pay that you might offer, benefits, which there's just a slew of different benefits, right? But traditionally it's medical, dental, vision, retirement, life insurance, disability insurance. Then there's this third area of well-being, right? That's the mental, emotional, and spiritual support and resources. So unique to the church and ministry world, right? That spiritual support element that's so integral to the health of ministry staff. The fourth being recognition and encouragement. For-profit organizations might call this performance management, right? But we want to lean in on, what people are strong at and then look at how people can grow. And it's not bad that we have growth areas, right? That's why we call that the recognition and encouragement. And then another area of development and growth, right? So that would be, what intentionally do we do to help individuals develop professionally and personally and to grow from the perspective of their role and within the organization. Yeah, so total rewards is putting all of these things together in a way and in a package that's designed to specifically motivate and engage the staff at your organization. So another piece of that art, right, in creating this is that it's tailored to your culture. It's tailored to your organization. So one, total reward strategy and package might not work as well at one organization as another. And that's okay. There's certain things you can tweak depending on your staff, like what they value, what you've learned from them, to really make it the best for you.
But if you try to look at, I'm just going to hire top talent, you will blow your entire ministry budget on payroll, because those people, while I appreciate, again, the value that they bring to every organization, they are going to ask for the top dollar because they know what their value is in the gifts that they bring. So there is an aim that I would say for every organization, and it's the word balance. I think there's a balance. There's kind of like a happy medium between deciding where you want to man, we can afford to do a little bit more here because that's a really important factor. You might decide missions is an entire huge focus for your organization, and you're willing to go a little bit more for a missions pastor or director because that's a focus for your organization. And so pick some hot spots that you would say are really vital to your organization. And you might decide that's where we decide to invest a lot of top talent, if you will.
Your next best step is a compensation survey. You can get started today by visiting sparkstaffing.co/compensation to opt in and contribute to a compensation survey that is going to leave your ministry and other ministries healthier. When you give to the ministry of Kingdom One, you're giving to this vision of courageous, healthy, and effective ministries that grow the church together. Your gift of $25 or more will help a small ministry staff take our above reproach AB 506 child safety and mandated reporting training. This means that when staff come across children and see the signs of abuse or neglect, they can make a report that will change that child's life for the better forever. You can do that by going to kingdomone.co/give. And until we chat again, let's grow the church together.